they should make those choices in the light of the best available information about what those choices mean. And they should be very straight with the public. I think the Prime Minister always talks about levelling with the public. They should be very straight with the public about why they've chosen what they have and what they think it means and stuff like that. Though obviously there are uncertainties when you're looking forward to things like forecasts and stuff like that. Yeah, there is some conjecture, though it has to be said, on forecasts there is very definitely a weight of economic opinion in one direction, that it is usually not good for your economy to put barriers up to trading with your biggest trading partner. Yeah, that is, of course, assuming no other policy changes. So what I'm going to do, what I said I would talk about, is sort of governing after Brexit. So I thought I'd do a very quick canter around the governance landscape, if you like. I know you had Catherine Barnard, my colleague at UK and Changing Europe. Catherine has printed out all 1,246 pages of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. So hopefully you all had your opportunity to quiz Catherine on the minutiae of the TCA. I've read the TCA, can't claim to have been through the annexes in detail, but it is a difficult legal document. Even Catherine thinks it's difficult to understand. And if Catherine thinks it's difficult to understand, people who decide to do PPE rather than law, like me, that was my alternative choice if I hadn't got into Oxford, find it very difficult to follow at all. So talk about that, but I don't want to talk about the detail of the TCA, though we can go into that a bit if you're interested. What I wanted to talk about was doing that. So where are we? So we've got a deal. And actually the UK's relationship with the EU is governed going forward by two key documents. The key documents, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, as we all know, goes beyond trade into areas like aviation, fishing, not just the sort of pure milk of normal trade agreements, but also has a section on social security coordination, on law enforcement cooperation, and stuff like that. There's a separate document which governs the trade in goods between Great Britain, Northern Ireland, and the EU, which is the withdrawal agreement, the provisions in the Northern Ireland Protocol. And those are the sort of defining documents that set the framework of the future trading relationship. There are some decisions outstanding. Some are what are called autonomous decisions, the decision on data adequacy expected within 6 months, the decision that we've been hanging around waiting for some time, yet to emerge, open brackets, and maybe will never emerge, on whether the EU decides to widen the equivalence it's already granted to a couple of our financial services businesses. So there are a couple of strands where the EU has granted equivalence. But for the rest, it sets out a sort of agreed framework to operate in. There are still some decisions to be made in key areas, timelines, and lots of processes to try and improve the agreement. It was obviously negotiated in a rush. Most people looking at the length of time it takes the EU to agree trade agreements point to the fact that it's usually counted in years, not months. And actually the number of months they had to negotiate this agreement wasn't very different to what in some cases the number of years that the EU takes to do things. So this was done at incredible speed, and it's an amazing testament to the negotiations on both sides that there is an agreement at all. So that is a big plus. But what it does is set up a very complex governance structure with 20 odd committees, a sort of hierarchy that ends up in something called the Trade Partnership Committee, and sitting on top of that, the Partnership Council. The EU's announced that its chair of the Partnership Council will be Maros Sefcovic. He will combine that with chairing the Joint Committee, which oversees the Northern Ireland Protocol. We haven't yet heard who is going to be the UK co-chair. And the Institute for Government, Maddie Timmick-Jack and I have a paper coming out tomorrow saying that's one of the decisions government's got to make. But we say, actually, there are a lot of other sort of consequences of this complex agreement for the way in which government organizes itself. So that's the first thing I'm going to say. So probably one of the most correct, but also most least impactful reports I ever produced at the Institute for Government on Brexit was one that Julie McRae and I wrote in 2016, straight after the referendum, when we said the government will need to decide how it's going to run these negotiations. It would be a big mistake to set up a dedicated department for exiting the EU. We published that, I think, on the Monday. I was in the Cabinet Office giving it to a Cabinet Office minister to say, you need to read this and make sure that, that the candidates for the Conservative leadership get to see it. At the time, David Cameron set up a unit under Oliver Letwin to run it. As I was coming out of George Bridges' office, his private secretary was getting very excited because Andrea Leadsom was about to make a statement. The statement she was making on her doorstep was that she was withdrawing from the Conservative leadership contest, which effectively made Theresa May the leader immediately, and Theresa May took over as Prime Minister 2 days later and instituted those original machinery of government changes, creation of Department for exiting the EU and the creation of the Department for International Trade. Not sure those were terrifically well thought out. If any of you have seen the newspapers this week, you will see some pickup of an interview that UK and Change in Europe published on Monday with Philip Hammond, where he describes that as a basic rookie mistake that an intern wouldn't make and was a ludicrous decision. And I quote, as we said, Philip Hammond has decided to become box office, and the interview is full of what you might say quite spicy quotes. It's on, I've given Evelyn the link if you want to read Philip Hammond in full. If you want to read an alternative view from that cabinet, read Chris Grayling, who we've also published. We've got lots more interviews to come with people that we've been doing over the last few months. They're really, really interesting. Anyway, so we're suggesting tomorrow, the sneak preview of something we're putting out, the government needs to institute some degree of central control, because the thing that the government's got to do internally is coordinate across multiple different axes. It's got to coordinate the decisions coming out of that big network of committees that are being established under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. A lot of quite detailed, nerdy stuff that will be done by officials, but they need to actually know that they are negotiating and agreeing things within a framework which has ministerial buy-in. But some of those issues will require cross-departmental resolution, and some will have sort of unintended consequences for other parts of the agreement. So people need to have a grip on that overall structure. So that's the sort of first thing that they need to do. But that's necessary, but far from sufficient. There are other axes across which the government needs to coordinate. The first is the position of the Northern Ireland Protocol. Every time the UK decides something in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, it has implications potentially for Northern Ireland. So it's got to watch that angle. And Northern Ireland has to keep up to date with EU legislation. So remember, there was a lot in the 300 odd regulations directives that are listed in the Northern Ireland Protocol. So while GB can diverge passively or actively, Northern Ireland has to stay in line with if any of those 300 are updated. So we've got to keep a watch out for that. So that's one of the issues that we need to manage. And we'll have seen the consequences on Friday of somebody somewhere in the Commission thinking that something might be a good idea to do for one set of reasons, to stop vaccines leaking into non-EU countries like the UK, without consulting their colleagues adequately about quite what that would mean for the Northern Ireland Protocol. To not go through the correct processes, to get the Irish government coming down them like a ton of bricks, and generally do something that was really, frankly, incredibly crass and stupid. Anyway, water under the bridge, they've rowed back, but they have let a very sort of bad genie out of a bottle, because as we know, there's been background noises from the DUP ever since the beginning of January that the government should try to get out of the protocol that it negotiated in its withdrawal agreement in October 2019. So that's a warning of the problems of failure to think in advance about the consequence of your action. But that's not the only bit of coordination that's needed within government. The government also needs to work out how it is going to relate to the devolved governments. The devolved governments will want an input into this network of committees. If you read the interview in our witness archive with Philip Rycroft, the former permanent secretary at the Department for Exit in the EU, former, actually very uniquely for a British civil servant in the Whitehall government, has worked in the Scottish government as well. He will tell you that actually the government basically wasn't at all really interested in what the devolved governments had to contribute to the EU exit negotiations. Is that sustainable long term? The government also has to think through the consequence of any decisions it makes in the trade and cooperation agreement for the UK internal market, something that we hadn't really thought about or talked about before Brexit, but loomed very large. One of the very few times I spoke to Ollie Robbins when he'd just been appointed to DexEU, the first thing he said is, we've got to worry about the UK internal market. We now have the UK Internal Market Act with the annoying clauses about breaking international law deleted, but it's still much hated by both the Scottish and Welsh governments. And the Scots have explicitly said that they have introduced their own Continuity Act to say they, unlike the government of the UK, are going to keep in line with changes in the EU law. So that's something they've got to manage. So that's a complexity. There are people in the Cabinet Office who run a thing called the Constitution Group who manage relations with the devolves, both Internal Market Act, but also this process called Common Frameworks, where there's supposed to be lots of agreement about between the four nations or the three nations of the UK. Northern Ireland obviously a bit different about how they run things. So that's another axis. And the final two axes of coordination, to make this sound like a complete bureaucratic nightmare, open brackets, it is, close brackets, is the link to domestic policy. We've already seen some early signs that ministers are keen to explore the potential to diverge. We've got a consultation from DEFRA on gene editing. We've got a review in the business department of the Working Time Directive, long a bête noire of multiple UK governments, actually, that it's too intrusive and too clunky and not fit for purpose. So we don't know quite, but obviously those sorts of divergence have the potential under the TCA, and I'm sure Catherine spoke about this at great length, to trigger some of the very multiple and different dispute mechanisms. We have a consultation launched yesterday by the Business Department about the UK new state aid regime. But we also have, in a separate part of the forest and coordinated a bit elsewhere, the potential implications of new UK trade agreements. Liz Truss, the top-rated cabinet minister on Conservative Home, has just applied to join the CPTPP, the big Asia-Pacific trade partnership. She's trying to conclude trade deals, probably not imminently with the US, given the Biden administration, but with Australia and New Zealand. Somebody's got to make sure that they understand the read across is there into what we've committed to with our European partners. So there's a massive coordination job going on, needs to all be coordinated, and it needs to be within the context of a strategic framework of how does the UK want to relate to the EU long term. So far, all we've seen is a slightly unedifying spat over the status of the EU ambassador in the UK. Not very helpful, and the EU ambassador was immensely helpful apparently last Friday in sorting out this row. The main consequence of that so far has been that the Commission has cancelled meetings with the UK's newly appointed ambassador to the EU. This is not a sensible place for things to be. So that's the internal government structures. We'll need some ministerial decision making. Boris Johnson might think this is all okay to leave to his newly appointed Brexit and international policy representative, Lord Frost, but someone will need to be able to knock ministerial heads together. That means we need some cabinet committee structure. And as I said, we'll need a ministerial chair. for the Partnership Council. In our paper out tomorrow, we suggest that the logical person is Michael Gove. He's at the centre, he chairs the Joint Committee, and he knows a bit about Brexit. But there's going to, frankly, be quite a weird dynamic, whatever happens, between him and David Frost. We will see. So that's the sort of internal UK government bit. One of the things I think that we've noted in various reports is that the UK had suffered in the run-up to Brexit from a sort of diminution in EU skills and interests in government departments. The Foreign Office in particular, I don't know if any of you have read Kim Darroch's book about his exit from the Foreign Office, but he has a great account about when he went to FCO Human Resources saying, I think I might become an EU specialist. And the guy says, why on earth would you want to do that? That became quite clear, actually, that whereas, UPREP, the UK representation in Brussels, and investing in EU skills have been a route to the top in the Foreign Office, that has rapidly diminished going forward. It ended up with the permanent representative in the EU before Tim Barrow, the previous two coming from the Treasury, because actually they had people who were more versed in Treasury bits of interest in the EU, my old department, rather than the FCO. And around Whitehall, a lot of people didn't actually spend much time or effort on EU business. And once you can't be in the room negotiating, and because of Brexit, we're no longer in the room negotiating, it's not so clear that you'll attract people into those EU jobs. It'd be even less appealing. People want to go to the more fun diplomatic postings on the FCO side, and domestic departments might think it's a lower priority to send good people there. So that's a risk going forward someone needs to manage. What else? We talked about Parliament. You talked about Parliament. My colleague at UK and Change Europe, Meg Russell, and Dan Glover produced a report last week, a week before, called Taking Back Control, which is about the fact that Parliament had so little say over its own business, about time for debates and about control. And this is a real problem. Parliament voted last autumn to wind up Hilary Benn's future relationship, the EU committee. But when it had second thoughts, it actually had no way of really putting that to the House, because it was for Jacob Rees-Mogg, the leader of the House, to introduce a motion to give MPs the option of bringing Hilary's committee back to life or giving it a life extension. He decided not to, so the default, which was that the FREU disappeared, was activated, which seems a bit ridiculous. I think there's thoughts that actually, if Parliament had been given the choice to vote on it, it probably wouldn't have passed, because the government does, after all, have a majority of 80, even though most of the time it doesn't really look like it. But the one thing that the Conservatives do seem relatively united on is Brexit. So there probably wouldn't have been a mass revolt to keep Hillary in post. But it is quite indicative of how little say MPs really have about how they can do this. The Lords has sort of decided on some structures it's going to set up to scrutinise the deal, the Northern Ireland Protocol, and relations going forward. At the moment, there's a bit of a vacuum on the Commons side, might be some stuff done in the EU Scrutiny Committee. But the one thing that we absolutely know about this government is it's very scrutiny phobic. There have been arguments in Parliament about the role that Parliament should have on trade agreements. Parliament has had the option to give itself a role on trade agreements in the trade bill, which is currently in ping pong between the Commons and the Lords. But when the Commons was offered that option through an amendment by a Conservative backbencher, Jonathan Giangoli, it rejected it. So you could say Parliament had the option of having a bigger say on trade deals and decided not to take it. The government may end up being defeated, I think, on this thing on genocide, and whether the Parliament gets another vote if someone somewhere decides that there's been genocide. But the more general issue of trade policy, ministers have been quite successful in whipping against any Commons significant say, which means they have to fall back on the provisions of Gordon Brown's CRAG, Constitutional Reform and Governance Act. I think that's what it stands for. And those are very weak because basically the government can use lots of provisions to get around parliamentary scrutiny. So parliamentary scrutiny doesn't look very good. Hilary Benn's committee invited Michael Gove and David Frost to give evidence on the agreement before the committee died its death. And they said, sorry, no, we're not available, we're not coming. So I think there's a real big question mark about parliamentary scrutiny there. Big questions about scrutiny in the TCA because the Partnership Council can make really quite a lot of decisions. There's a thing that actually has gone on forward in the European Parliament, which of course still hasn't actually approved the deal. It's asked for more time, need to set the Partnership Council up quickly so that it can agree to extend the deadline for that beyond the February one in the agreement. But the German Greens have been suggesting that there should be much more parliamentary involvement in the operation and the oversight of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. So Parliament, a big question mark. What else? Where else do we go in terms of the landscape? Devolution, we could go into devolution if you're interested in devolution, but obviously the whole experience of the internal market bill, the whole experience of the process of negotiating Brexit, put unprecedented strain on the union, all very difficult coming out in Scotland, Holyrood elections, May, June, or whenever. Talk about that if you want down the line. Northern Ireland, lots of strains showing and not being managed brilliantly by the government at the moment. We'll have to see where Michael Gove's negotiations with Maros Sefcovic get there in terms of something around the protocol and how they make that work. Of course, one of the reasons why the protocol is so difficult to work is because the government's agreement in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement was so distanced from the EU. Every time GB is distanced more from the EU, the border in the Irish Sea becomes deeper. The courts. Remember, one of the big arguments for the government, one of the big government red lines was the need to exclude the ECJ. And on this, they can sort of tick the sovereignty box. They've, pretty much succeeded in wiping the ECJ off the face. So whatever disputes under the TCA are referred to arbitration panels of experts and things like that, not to the ECJ. There is a bit of residual ECJ oversight, issues in the protocol, and some of the withdrawal agreement and things like citizens' rights. But basically, the UK's can say it's no longer under the jurisdiction of the ECJ, which was a clear view of the government that it wanted to deliver. The government's not super duper keen on the courts more generally, I think it's fair to say. In the Conservative manifesto last year, it promised a review of quite a lot of elements of the Constitution. This was the famed page 48 of the manifesto, I think it was, which promised this. They have set up a review of judicial review under Lord Foulkes, who's a skeptic about judicial review. And ministers are concerned that judges have been over-interpreting their ability and that the Supreme Court, the courts have been making policy rather than sticking to their properly defined judicial role. You find people like Jonathan Sumption probably agree that that is right. If I was Brenda Hale, I'm not Brenda Hale, but if I were Brenda Hale, I would say, actually, if you look at the big Brexit court judgments, they didn't do that at all. What they did was say to government, you must ask Parliament. They were actually protectors of Parliament rather than policymakers per se. But anyway, we'll wait to see where that review goes to. If you roll forward and look more generally at where are we, and I'm conscious I've taken a bit too much time, so I'll stop rabbiting now. I mean, if you look at sort of where we are sort of post-Brexit, I think, we've got the future of the union. That's a big issue. I think interesting to see where the government goes on the courts. Parliamentary sovereignty, it's a very powerful thing. There are governance gaps. This has been a big concern, particularly of a lot of NGOs that used to look to EU oversight to make sure that the UK protected certain rights. If you spoke to environmental NGOs, they are, for instance, much more worried about the loss of the European Court of Justice to enforce environmental obligations. Government is supposed to be setting up something called the Office for Environmental Protection, but announced last week that the Environment Bill that sets that up would be quite badly delayed. So we won't see the OEP until sometime in the autumn. There's a big difficulty actually about entrenching anything in the UK now because of parliamentary sovereignty. So we've sort of, basically what Parliament decides it can more or less do. Coming back to where I was, you've noticed I'm a former civil servant. I think one of the really interesting things is, what did Brexit do to political views of the civil service and ministers' relations? Slightly ironically, from a civil service point of view, it was easier to work with Boris Johnson's government than to work with Theresa May's government. And the reason for that, nothing to do with Dominic Cummings, but as a civil servant, it's hugely easier to work for a government that is basically of a single mind and knows what it wants to do, than to work for a government where collective responsibility is broken down. Ministers are all over the place, and what you're told to do depends on your Secretary of State. They can be completely different things. And the government basically looks like a rabbit in front of a headlight. So anyway, so whatever. But we do know that under Dominic Cummings, Michael Gove, there was a big civil service reform agenda. Michael Gove set out some not desperately interesting ideas at his Ditchley lecture last July. We were promised a white paper. That white paper is very missing in action. The first concrete signs of some of this civil service reform is likely to come when we see the announcement, probably in the budget, of some civil service relocation plans, the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, building a base in Manchester, big debates about whether my former colleagues in the Treasury go to Leeds or Newcastle or end up in Darlington. So it'd be very interesting to see how that goes. Is that fundamental reform? Not really, but it seems to be where some of the action is. Other things like longer terms in post, they've been around for ages. If this government can crack it, all power to them. Other people have tried and not managed it so far. But I think the more worrying thing from the civil service point of view was last year the dispatching of lots of permanent secretaries. Interestingly, though, all replaced with really conventional appointments. So it was very odd. It seemed to be more personality than whatever. Civil service seems to be striking back a bit this year. We've had the reappointment of Tom Scholar, the permanent secretary of the Treasury, who was on the notoriously briefed S**T list, along with 3 other permanent secretaries who were let go in different circumstances last year. I think it's the nicest way of putting it. I think more worrying for the civil service, we've seen that the government's quite willing to flout convention in some ways. And that makes it really difficult if you're at the top of an office and you have ministers who appear to be making sort of serially at the margin decisions. I think it's might be said, slightly dodgy procurement. Why quite are these people getting funds? And not these areas? Is it anything to do with target seats and things like that? And that actually becomes quite difficult to hold the line on, and particularly when it's against a background of a willingness to terminate civil service careers if they fall out with the minister in charge. That makes the operating environment quite difficult. It can have a chilling effect on advice. And as we've seen if any of you on Twitter, can I highly recommend him as a great follower, the former head of the government legal department, Jonathan Jones, who resigned over the internal market bill's threat to break international law. It can actually force some people to say, actually, this is now pushing me too far. I can't put up with this. And I'm going to go, and re-emerge as quite trenchant critics of some of the government things. So I think we wait to see whether this all settles down with the post-Cummings era. Boris Johnson replaced his chief of staff, not with Lee Kane, the director of strategic communications, ex-vote leaver, but basically with a re-employed ex-Treasury civil servant, someone for whom lots of civil servants have a lot of time, a guy called Dan Rosenfield. So it's arguable that that phase is now gone and ministerial civil service relations will go. I'm not going to say that the civil service doesn't need reform, but I think if we want to have a very different, much more politicized civil service, then we do at least need to have a debate about it rather than have it by stealth. Anyway, that's my main, that's going to be my main thing. So I think there are a lot of things up in the air. I think the really interesting thing, and some of this is in the Brexit and Beyond report from UK and a Changing Europe that Evelyn has, I think, put a link to in the chat, is do we actually think that we're governed right? Do we think we need some sort of written constitution? It may be that the debate over the future of Scotland comes to some idea about whether we end up having to offer a more federal, entrenching sort of offer to the Scots with sort of permanent fixed rights for the default. Maybe part of the lessons of the pandemic, about which I've barely spoken, is that we need to re-empower and give more power to our big elected mayors. Maybe people don't like that at all. Maybe they think Andy Burnham's, too mouthy by half, and they'd rather they didn't have him. I'm sure the government on various occasions thinks that. But I think it's very interesting. I think a lot of things are up in the air, and the sort of revolution in the way we're governed that Brexit has set off is still very much a work in progress. So I'm going to stop there.